And so now, to help us carry on this conversation, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Stephanie Brutels. Stephanie is the director of SFU-BD's Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability and the founder of the Embedding Project. And that brings together leading global firms to help them embed sustainability across their operations. Stephanie partners regularly with executive teams and boards of global companies that are focused on improving their sustainability performance. And today, Stephanie is going to share some insights into strategies to embed sustainability into organizations. So Stephanie, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll pass things over to you.
Thanks, Lori. It's a delight to be here today. So when we think about embedding sustainability, where we really need to begin is with the conversation that you started with last time. And that's really understanding that on every dimension, whether that's population, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and land use, we're seeing rapid growth and we're seeing an acceleration of that growth. And as a result of that, the world is beginning to recognize that, in fact, there are limits to economic growth. And that as we move forward in our strategic planning, we really need to think about, on a number of different dimensions, how as an economy, we're going to start to bend those curves back in the right direction. And so that really means thinking about a shift to systems value. So there has been a lot of talk lately about the shift between shareholder value and stakeholder value. And that certainly has been an important part of the conversation. And it was one that was recognized even by the Business Roundtable in the United States last year. But at the same time, what we see is that shift from shareholder value into stakeholder value, or a triple bottom line or a shared value framework, often for companies still results in well-intended initiatives, but not necessarily really changing the fundamental strategy of the business. And so increasingly, the leading companies are starting to realize that they are embedded within a set of social systems, embedded within an environmental system, and that all of those really have an impact on their strategy going forward. And so what leading companies are starting to think about is really, how do they manage those tensions and try and pursue systems value? So what that means then is that our approach to strategy making really needs to shift. And it's about institutionalizing within your strategy process and within your capital allocation process this understanding of the need to get to know those environmental and social systems, understand the resilience and health of them, and then understand what role your company needs to be playing in helping to maintain them. So 50 years ago, Mike Porter told us that we really needed to be looking around at understanding new entrants, understanding the potential for substitutes, understanding the needs of our buyers, and understanding the resilience and health of our suppliers in order to really manage business. But there are two other important forces that we need to think about, and that's the societal resilience of the communities where we operate and the underlying environmental systems health. And so what's driving the shift that we're seeing in the economy? The most important of the shifts really has been this movement towards the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So in the wake of the last financial crisis, the G20 came together and the Financial Stability Board asked themselves the question, what could be the next trigger for a major economic crisis? And what came forward really was the potential impacts from climate change and specifically from the physical and transition risks that it might present. And so as a result of that, it has actually really changed conversations in boardrooms, because it spread out through the sovereign banks, into the AAA banks, and then into the lending conversations of major financial institutions. And as a result of that, has made its way into boardrooms all over the world. And it sparks a conversation really that is changing from a historical focus on forecasting to complement that forecasting work with scenario planning work, to really start to think about what the future might look like. And as a result of that, what does that create in terms of the impetus to be prepared for that and to allocate capital in order to be on track to do that. And so as a result, we're seeing a host of companies around the world that are starting to articulate a science-based target, which is to say a climate target that aligns with the IPCC's, the International Panel on Climate Change, recommendations for keeping our system within 1.5 degrees of global warming. And so as a result, we've seen a lot of companies over the last year start to articulate commitments to net zero by 2050. And some companies even start to create the climate pledge to recognize the need to get started on this and act more quickly and start to try and achieve net zero by 2040. So all of these climate commitments really become a signal that our market, our economy has started to accept the idea that there are limits. And if we look at the green part of the curve that I'm showing, what we also realize is that to actually really get down to that level, it's not only going to be a reduction in emissions, it actually is going to require some negative emissions in the sense of some carbon capture and storage. And so climate, though, is also just the beginning of the constraints that companies are starting to face and realizing that they need to work within. And we've seen a movement across Canada and in the province of British Columbia around the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And just last week at the G7 meeting, we saw an announcement that there will be a new task force on nature-related financial disclosure. So what does that mean for companies then? It starts with undertaking a thorough scan of the environmental and social conditions around you and understanding the extent to which your business has direct impacts and indirect impacts within your value chain on these various issues, and understanding where you might be best placed to try and help to support and act on them. And then it's really about acknowledging the role that you need to play when it comes to environmental, social, and governance factors, and also in setting credible strategies and credible goals and targets to achieve it. So one of the places where we really need to start then for many companies is around understanding what issues are in fact most material to them. And our second panel today is really going to pick up on this theme. And David will walk us through how it is that companies can start to think about identifying these material issues. Where most companies have started is to have conversations with external stakeholders and to start to understand what they're seeing in terms of the issues that matter to them, but also the constraints that that may place on the business. And that is a really important part of getting started on this process. I would encourage companies as well, though, to think about really reflecting in a very systematic way on the various planetary boundaries. So whether that's climate change or biodiversity, ocean acidification, to think about to what extent these changes and also the crises that we're facing in particular issues. For instance, we are seeing an enormous amount of loss in biodiversity. There's a lot of conversation about the thresholds that we're crossing with respect to climate, but maybe the thresholds that we're crossing with respect to phosphorus and nitrogen get less attention these days. And for some industries, that's going to actually be quite relevant. and to also really think about the local economic resilience, the social resilience of the communities where you're operating, and taking the time to understand and ask those communities about their resilience. So it's also about prioritizing where you may be able to have the greatest impact. And so which issues are the ones where you have direct impacts, where you there are big impacts sitting within your value chain or the customer's use of your product or what you're financing, or simply because of your resources, because of your access, because of your influence, that you might be able to provide positive influence within the system and be able to act in trying to help move things along. And then, we encourage companies as well to articulate a credible position on key issues. So investors are now starting to ask for this. We've seen thousands of position statements issued in the last year on various topics, whether that was on climate change and climate risk, on Black Lives Matter, on Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So there is a need for companies to help the general public, to help the communities around them, and to help investors understand where they're taking, what approach they're taking and what position they have on that issue. And so we've compiled for you a database, and this benefited from support from CPA Canada to help you identify leading position statements. And then the next piece then is to think about also setting credible goals. And so similarly, we've assembled a goal database that helps you identify leading commitments set by companies around the world in a range of industries. It helps you to benchmark your own goals. And if you're in the process of designing goals, to get a sense of what strong, credible goals look like. And so you can filter a search based on sector, based on issue, based on company. And it really gives you a sense of how to set a goal. And we're very transparent in the public information we've used and gathered, and we provide those examples. So those databases, both on position statements and on goals, may be a really helpful starting point for you, for those that are earlier in their journey or those that want to benchmark against best practice. So we have a ton of free resources to help get you started on your change journey. And so I just encourage you to go ahead and use those resources.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephanie. You have brought such a rich and informed perspective to the discussion. And just to put a plug in for the Embedding Project that Stephanie was just going through, that public database that you've compiled with the leading goals and commitments, position statements for benchmarking is really a helpful resource. I've spent some time in there myself, and I found it to be incredibly helpful. So I do encourage everyone to take a look at that. So now we are going to transition into a broader discussion on what companies should be considering to effectively embed ESG principles. And our goal in this discussion is to get you thinking about how you can begin operationalizing ESG and hopefully how it can add value to your business. So to join this conversation, I'd like to welcome Bosa Kasorik of Bennett Jones. And Bosa is counsel in Bennett Jones's Vancouver office, where she advises clients on a variety of securities and corporate law matters. And that includes public disclosure obligations as well as governance matters. So welcome, Bosa. You are a perfect addition to our discussion. So before we get underway, I want to remind participants that you can enter a question in the Q&A function. It's right at the bottom of your window. And we are monitoring the questions, and I will do my best to incorporate your questions into the discussion. So I'd like to start by just taking us back to Stephanie's presentation. I have a couple of follow-up questions, and I certainly learned a lot. So Stephanie, you made the case, and you cited examples and evidence about how there are limits to corporate growth. Can you talk to us about the role of innovation, maybe fueled by ESG strategy, when there are these limits to corporate growth? So to put it differently, can innovation set a course for organizational and economic growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's going to be key going forwards, is that the constraints that organizations are going to face in terms of these societal and environmental limits, really, many organizations have already started to come up with very innovative ways to try and address them. We're seeing a big investment in companies into nature-based solutions as an example of ways to try and replenish and regenerate from a biodiversity perspective, and also as a way to be able to cope with some carbon emissions or be able to offset those emissions in some cases. And on the social side as well, we're seeing a big shift in delivery mode. We're seeing companies that are starting to really partner with various communities by understanding their needs better. Then they're able to actually deliver solutions that meet those needs, and then find out that those solutions also meet broader societal needs as well. So I think that, here at BD, we always teach that creativity requires constraint. And so as we, view these constraints not as something to be feared, but rather as an inspiration and a source for innovation, I think that will put us on a good path.
And if you have growth that's driven by innovation, are there limits to that growth, or does it become a circle and it repeats itself?
Well, I think the reality is there's only so many resources. We know that we are using a lot of resources. So certainly in the short term, a huge focus is going to need to be on efficiency. There's still a lot more efficiency that we can find in the current economic systems that we have. But there also is the reality that we know that we as a species have placed a lot of pressure on the planet, and we also know that the systems in many cases that we have developed have resulted in an inequality in who has access to those resources and who benefits from those resources. So those things are going to need to shift. But for individual businesses, it doesn't necessarily mean that individual businesses can't grow. It's just that we need to be very conscious in how we go about that growth and the impacts of that growth.
Thank you. And Bo, so let me bring you into the conversation. We all probably think we know what governance is, but in an ESG context, what exactly does good governance entail?
Yeah, thanks, Lori. So, good governance at its core really means creating ESG strategies that are embedded, that are customized, and that are holistic. ESG is not a new concept. We know that organizations, particularly in the mining or the oil and gas industries in BC and across Canada, have already been factoring ESG considerations into their decision-making for years. What is new, however, and what we're seeing is the momentum and the demand for ESG information. And I think practically what this means is that ESG has to be woven into the fabric of a company's core operations. And companies have to take an active rather than a passive approach to environmental and social matters and the risks and opportunities that presents. Really, a fundamental concept of ESG is that it isn't one size fits all. Companies have to determine, establish, and address sort of the key material ESG issues, risks, and opportunities that are specific to them, to the regions and industries in which they operate, and to the services and functions that they provide or perform. And as part of making those determinations, directors are entitled to and should rely on the advice of senior management and the advice of their advisors to ensure that they're getting, the types of information that they need to really structure and develop their vision of the business and craft a customized and holistic ESG strategy for the company from a top-down approach. Really, it's key that companies take a holistic approach to ESG matters and ensure that ESG is a priority for the company and that it's being fully considered and integrated into the overall strategy of the business. it has to be an executive and board level priority. It has to be cross-functional, and it needs to really be considered at, all levels of the organization. Fundamentally, I think it's about really just recognizing the importance of ESG, making sure that you're keeping current on it, and really embedding all of those considerations into pretty much everything you do.
No easy solution. It's complex. Stephanie, is there anything you'd like to add about good governance in an ESG context?
Yeah, I just think we're seeing a movement towards this being part of every component of governance. And so, initially we were seeing the creation of environmental health and safety committees or sustainability committees or CSR committees. But in fact, now that we're seeing from an oversight perspective that this is an important part of every single governance process. So as Bozo was saying, it's everything from the nominations process so that you ensure that you have people on the board that have a strong understanding of these issues and know when to raise them. It's having it in your audit committee because this needs to become part of the core financial metrics of the business and a core part of the capital allocation process. It's making sure that you discuss it even in the HR committee in terms of how you're treating employees. And it's also in the comp committee. So how are executives being compensated? To what extent are ESG factors being incorporated into those executive compensation schemes? And how are you looking at it from embedding it as you think about compensation in terms of equity across the organization at various different levels? So it's, every aspect of governance now needs to have an ESG lens as part of it. And I think we are seeing that evolution certainly happening in BC companies.
Great. So I'm going to step away from governance and think more particularly about disclosure. And we know that ESG disclosure is often voluntary. And we've talked about the many really compelling reasons for a company to go about voluntarily taking on disclosure. But Bosa, perhaps you can level set for us. And in a broad way, can you describe the legal requirements for corporations to disclose and report on ESG risks and opportunities from a legal technical perspective?
Sure, thanks, Laurie. I think one of the challenges really is that ESG reporting isn't a check the box exercise, and there isn't really any bright line test for compliance or what constitutes good disclosure from a legal perspective. And on top of that, you add the multitude of sort of the voluntary disclosure frameworks, as you pointed out, and that organizations need to evaluate, and that just further complicates matters. Really, unfortunately, aside from certain very prescribed disclosure requirements under securities and corporate law, primarily relating to disclosure around diversity, disclosure on ESG matters is really very largely based on guidance. Recently in 2019, the Canadian Securities Administrators came out with some guidance on climate change reporting, which was certainly an important ESG related step for the regulators. And while they were clear in their guidance that they weren't creating any new legal requirements or even modifying existing ones, it was very indicative, I think, of the fact that they're really starting to become more willing to lead the dialogue on what they think is an appropriate approach to ESG related disclosure. And more importantly, that they are going to be evaluating disclosure and that they're going to be holding issuers accountable for what they perceive to be insufficient or inadequate disclosure. And, unfortunately, other than the limited guidance and a few of these prescribed sort of elements, I think really what issuers are left to determine their disclosure from a compliance perspective is the basis of materiality. And that's not a new concept for public companies under Canadian securities laws. Issuers have to disclose all material information regarding their business and affairs. And the fundamental principle there is that issuers should really provide all of the information that would be material to an investor's investment decision. including material information about ESG issues. And I think the regulators have made it clear that while the guidance doesn't modify, the existing materiality standard, it does apply to ESG factors and ESG disclosures. So, we're really ending up with what's a bit of a variety of different standards, which are largely based on guidance, which need to be navigated. And I think, standardization will be a welcome development in the space. And I think that will probably help eliminate some of these issues and uncertainties.
Thank you. So it really makes ESG reporting on risk similar to other business risks. Of course, we know, and as you pointed out, Rosa, ESG compliance is an evolving space. And it might be that more and more regulators and governments look to mandate further ESG disclosures. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. So I'm going to go back to voluntary reporting. And I'll look at Stephanie first. We know there are various recognized voluntary reporting frameworks and guidance, GRI, SASB, to name a couple. What should companies be considering when contemplating the various reporting frameworks and guidance?
Yeah, I think that some of these can be very helpful, especially when you're first getting started. They provide a structure, they provide a set of prescriptions for action. Although when you're thinking about it, you want to use them as a template for action and to provide some guidance for you rather than relying on them as a formula in terms of what you should be reporting on. And so really it boils down to that how you approach that materiality process, and also not thinking about materiality as an event on its own that is distinct from the overall strategy process. So you really want to start using that opportunity to speak to others outside of the organization as a broader sense-making process for the company, to help you think about what some of those strategic risks and opportunities may be for your business, to help you understand where you may have direct impacts, and as a result of that, if they remain unmitigated, that they may provide sources of business disruption risk. And then also to really start looking, into your value chain. And you mentioned this earlier, a movement towards thinking about it from a procurement and supply chain perspective. Those obligations and expectations are becoming quite clear in terms of companies having that sense deep into their supply chain, but also thinking about customer use of their product and return of that product, and even the means through which they're shipping and delivering that product. And you talked at the outset here about this evolution in the standard space. And frankly, I think some of this mandatory disclosure is coming. So we've seen New Zealand has already made it mandatory for companies to report against the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. There are several other global jurisdictions that are contemplating that as well. So I think we're not far off from a situation where this moves out of the realm of voluntary and starts to move into the realm of required.
I like how you put that, Stephanie. Thinking about these frameworks is really more a template for action. That's well put. So it's really not transactional at all. It's really part of that ongoing evolution of continuous reporting. Rosa, let me turn to you. On the same topic around reporting, can you share with us some best practices to consider when thinking about how to approach disclosure?
Sure. Yeah, I think I think issuers sort of are as Stephanie pointed out, are taking a more tailored approach and using the relevant parts of multiple different frameworks and adapting them to prepare disclosure that is sort of appropriate and specific to their circumstances, rather than just adopting a one-size-fits-all framework. But what we are seeing as some of the best practices that issuers are sort of keeping in mind when they're preparing this disclosure is that the disclosure really should be focused on entity-specific ESG factors that are both material and relevant to the company. If there's a question as to whether certain ESG factors are material, issuers are erring on the side of materiality and disclosing the relevant information. They're avoiding the boilerplate language and the comply or explain approaches that we've seen, as prevalent for a lot of public companies in recent years around things like, gender diversity disclosure. They are using forward-looking and balanced and objective ESG disclosure, and they're not just focusing on, their positive achievements. They're also reporting, frankly, on some of the challenges they're facing, some of the issues and mistakes that they've made. So they're getting a very balanced and holistic picture. The metrics that they're using are reliable, and they're measurable, and they're comparable. Their quantitative ESG data is disclosed consistently from year to year and across their various disclosure documents, so that investors can really identify trends and compare both the issuer's own disclosure sort of against itself and previous years, as well as across other issuers. Where possible, they're also sort of making sure that they explain and describe the link between their ESG metrics and their financial performance. And they're demonstrating how these ESG initiatives are driving growth and productivity and risk management in real monetary terms. But I think, most importantly, I think what you have to do and what issuers are doing is that they're ensuring that their chosen framework or the disclosure that they're providing is applied consistently in both voluntary reporting as well as sort of the mandatory continuous disclosure filings for public issuers under securities laws. It's not sufficient under securities laws for material ESG information to be contained only in voluntary reporting documents. And issuers really still have to remember that they have to continue to comply with securities law requirements. And they have to disclose material information on a timely basis, not just in voluntary reporting. I think, ultimately, Stephanie pointed out, I think we're heading towards a level of standardization of ESG reporting frameworks. But I think until we get there, the importance of well-tailored and really well-defined and consistent disclosure can't be sort of overstated.
Thank you for that. There's no question it needs to be entity-specific and really tied to those overall goals for the organization. So I'm going to go on, and I'd like to talk about some of the challenges organizations are seeing around ESG disclosures today. And I thought I'd hit on data quality to start with, which is something we really care about in the accounting profession. And we, of course, know that investors and others rely on ESG information in their decision-making, and in some cases, even more so than financial reporting information. So for that reason, it follows that ESG data and reporting really needs to have the same rigor, the same level of oversight as financial data and reporting, both operationally and from a governance perspective. But that means you need the inputs, you need to get there. And you need to constantly refine the quality of ESG data. And that means having those rigorous processes and internal controls, like what you'd see on the financial side, really to ultimately see the accuracy and completeness of the data, and that leads to the related disclosure. And I know that often it appears that companies are disclosing ESG metrics without fully substantiated and supporting information, and that could be a threat to the credibility of the organization and really the utility of the ESG disclosure to the end user, all going, of course, to trust. And it's definitely my view that the trust of stakeholders can be built if ESG data is elevated to the same quality as financial data. So I'm going to throw that down as a real challenge to ESG disclosure and something that requires focus. Every organization needs to figure out how to tackle the data quality issue and make sure that they are gathering that same data, that consistent data that is useful for decision-making purposes. So Stephanie, maybe let me turn to you, get your reaction, and also ask if there are other risks and challenges beyond data quality that we need to watch out for in the context of disclosure and governance.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that organizations face, and especially recognizing that a large percentage of businesses in British Columbia are small and medium-sized enterprise, and that's time and resources. So I think it is really important to actually think about the difference, for instance, between disclosure and reports. So a lot of times when I talk to smaller companies, they say, well, we don't have a sustainability report, and so we're going to spend a lot of time, or we're going to start working on a sustainability report. And my advice often is, do you really need the sustainability report? And so, sometimes what you just really need is better disclosure. And so articulating a clear position on how you're going to approach particular problems or issues, and really setting some meaningful, credible goals with realistic interim targets and clear commitments of capital to meeting those targets and reporting against those targets, and discussing the process of how and why you set those goals is really what people are looking for. And so all of the rest of the stuff that goes into producing a sustainability report is an in my view, not the most important piece, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises to be focusing on. It's a different thing if you're an issuer in a big multinational company. There are expectations on you in terms of the level of reporting. But for most businesses in BC, I would say focus on really trying to link this to your core capital allocation and strategy process. Set some goals on the most material issues, and be really clear on how and why you're setting those goals, looking for input from others and whether they think you've set the right goals, and just be really clear in the process that you are taking in order to achieve them.
Thank you, Stephanie. And you've taken us where I wanted to go, which is really to the SME space in BC. And in BC, we have such a great number of small and medium-sized enterprises here, and some are making sincere, significant contributions in the ESG space. And Stephanie, you talked about the importance of setting goals, but what is the minimum requirement for a governance framework if a company is just starting to embark on an ESG journey? What's the minimum that they need to do?
So I think the minimum is to do a thorough environmental and social scan. That's the place where I would start, is asking your management team to ensure that they have really reflected on what the environmental and social issues could be that are strategically relevant to your business, either because they can present risks and opportunities to you, or because as a business, directly or through your value chain, you have impacts on them. And that's the materiality conversation that David is going to pick up in the next panel. And then the next, I think, is to have a clear sense then of what your role is going to be in addressing some of those. And so then that goes to goal setting. But too often we see those goals set as very big, long-term ambitious goals, rather than treating them as the more short-term tactical goals. So I like to talk about this idea of committing to commit. Often when we start working with companies and supporting them in goal setting, the first goal that they need to set is actually to set a goal. And the reason I say that is because they often don't have enough of the underlying information and understanding of what would constitute a good and credible goal. And so sometimes the very first place to start is actually just committing to make a commitment in the future.
Great point. Organizations just need to start on the journey and make that commitment. So I'm going to go to the question from the audience. How do we ensure there is meaningful action and avoid, or at least identify and hopefully preempt, greenwashing? And what are the key things you recommend to the companies you work with? Bosa, would you have a view on that? How to avoid greenwashing?
I think this goes back to sort of what we've already said. Good governance and sort of good disclosure comes from having good ESG practices in place. It's about sort of taking that holistic approach from the top down and embedding ESG into every aspect of the business and the strategy. So that when it does come time to disclose and report, you have real information and data and sort of measurable and comparable, both quantitative and qualitative disclosure that you can share. I think where that doesn't happen, that's where you start to get some of the things like boilerplate language, or the comply or explain approach, and sometimes that can be seen sort of as greenwashing by investors or other stakeholders. So I think really it just has to be a top-down holistic approach.
Excellent comments. Stephanie, anything you'd like to add? And perhaps also we could expand beyond greenwashing to think about social washing, or unduly putting out that position that might not be genuine.
Yeah, and I mean, this is exactly why we created those position statement and goals databases, because we wanted to provide tools to the general public, but also to companies themselves, and starting to think about how they would really be able to judge a position or a goal. And so I think when you're looking for meaningful action, there's a couple of things to look for. Do they explain the issue? So do they actually have an understanding of the underlying issue? Do they make a meaningful connection between the issue and the company's strategy? So they've really thought and reflected on how it's going to impact them, but also the impact that they have. So do they share what they see as their direct and indirect impacts on the issue? And then have they set a credible target that actually really commits to doing their part in helping to solve the issue? And those are, the criteria we use in the database, and those are the criteria that I suggest when people are trying to take a look at goals, because asking that set of questions gets you somewhere very quickly. If a company is saying we're going to make a 30% reduction in water, or we're going to increase our diversity by 20%, if they're not giving you the context, is 20% good? Is it bad? What's your starting point? Is that what's needed? How fast are you going to get there? So this is the kind of level of interrogation that I think we need to move towards when we're starting to really assess goals.
Thank you for that. Now, we're running a little short of time, but I would like to give both Bosa and Stephanie the opportunity to make a final comment on how sustainability goals can be strengthened through governance. Bosa, how about we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. Like I said, I think it comes to it not being just about reporting. You have to set the goals, but then you also have to live it. You have to be authentic about it, and you have to be credible about it. It's not just a once a year discussion or a once a year reporting exercise when it's time for your annual filings or your financial statements. It has to be just entrenched in your day-to-day business and practices.
Thank you. And Stephanie, let's hear from you.
For me, it comes down to one question for boards and executive teams to ask themselves is, will we be perceived as doing our part? And if the answer to that is not yes, then that presents a risk in the long term to your business.
Thank you both for an amazing and incredibly important conversation. It's clear ESG is now a strategic imperative. It's not transactional. It needs to be continuous and thoughtfully embedded throughout the organization with appropriate oversight. Thank you to the audience. It's so important we keep this conversation going. Greg, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thanks so much, Laurie, and thanks, Stephanie and Bosa, for a great conversation. I've said it before, I have one of the best jobs in the country. Every day I get to sit down and listen and participate in conversations with informed and smart people like the three of you. And it's just been a real privilege to have you expose your expertise and share your guidance with us today. It struck me while I was listening that every firm or company, regardless of size or which sector they're in, is at a different place along your ESG journey and thinking. And the concept can be threatening given the additional potential requirements for disclosure or reporting or measurement and some of the corresponding capacity requirements you're going to need to execute. But each firm's rationale for considering requirements and the incorporation of ESG disclosure and action to achieving your goals and strategy are as diverse as the challenges and risks, but they also afford that realization of the potential benefits that you can gain through this process in differentiating your business and retaining employees, but also attracting capital in a competitive market. So your comments today have had a real material benefit for each of us and the audience members signing in this morning. And as they contemplate ESG, they're going to be thinking about what it means for their firms, their employees, their customers, and communities. So I want to thank you again, Stephanie, and thank you, Boza, and of course, Laurie, not only for your comments and guiding the conversation this morning, but also to take a moment to acknowledge you and thank the CPAs of BC for being our presenting sponsor today. So thank you all very much.